the activity in the essentially the Trump crime docket was rather intense this week. There were multiple stories, sort of almost following two different tracks. One dealing with Manafort and another dealing with Jerome Corsi and Stone. And then they converged in a sort of like third track in a story from The Guardian about Manafort meeting with Julian Assange. We'll talk about that. I want to put a pin in that for a moment because that story we don't have as confirmed as at least what was going on here. And what I'm talking about is the essentially the collapse of the Paul Manafort plea deal, which, as you know, Heather, was a massive plea deal. It basically took all of Manafort's assets, something like $42 million, which pays for the entire Mueller investigation. It involved Manafort essentially giving Mueller everything. And if he ever held back, if he ever lied, then Manafort would not only be dealing with the charges that he found guilty on, but be facing other criminal counts that he hadn't yet been tried yet. And this week, Heather, the deal falls apart. Tell us, what's that about?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we had expected Manafort to be sentenced just before Thanksgiving, and they came in at the final moment and said, we need 10 more days, and the judge granted it. And a lot of people, who follow this sort of thing said that was weird, that, to just ask for a 10-day extension meant that something was happening. Now, the assumption on a lot of people's part was that this was, meant that there were indictments coming down. As it turns out, and there had been some reporting to this effect, that that Manafort was not being cooperative and that the Mueller team was getting upset. So we kind of knew that was a possibility, but I think we were all sort of, going, hoping against hope that it was something less, less complicating, that they were actually going to be indicting a few people and that they were waiting for the sentencing for those indictments to come down. But as it turns out, it was that, and it was that the Mueller team came in and just said, he's been lying to us. And, you cannot do that. You go into a plea agreement with a cooperation with the government, and you say that you're going to cooperate. If you expect to get a sentencing reduction or any of the other sort of, kind of appeasement, you're going to have to cooperate 100%. They say it very clearly. You cannot lie. You've got to tell them everything. They basically own you at that moment. In fact, prosecutors call it, they're working for Team USA now, right? It's kind of silly, but that's what they say. So you're on the prosecutor's team from the moment you make that agreement. And we've seen evidence of that from others, in this instance and in other instances. So it turns out Manafort's been lying. And we don't know what specifically he's been lying about, although the Mueller team did indicate that when they submitted their sentencing memorandum to the judge, which will ask for very harsh penalties for all of this, the lying may actually be added on to what they are claiming for him. And he's got a previous conviction, and he pled guilty to these other crimes. I mean, he is and as you pointed out, he's already forfeited all his property. I mean, it's millions and millions of dollars worth of property that he forfeited. He is also within that plea agreement. He's subject to state charges on all of this that he has now officially pled guilty to. It was one of those plea agreements where you kind of went, there's no way this guy is not going to spill everything he knows, because everything is on the line, everything he owns, his future, and the fact that it really is kind of pardon-proof because of this fact that he's pled guilty to crimes that evidence of his guilt can be applied to state charges in places like New York or I guess Virginia and others where he committed these crimes. So no one expected him not to cooperate, although it's possible that Robert Mueller did, because Manafort has been lying and cheating from the very beginning of this. He had a bail agreement, and he violated it. You know, he was witness tampering. I mean, the guy has shown absolutely no indication that he's going to follow these instructions. So perhaps Mueller understood that this was going to happen. Now, the big complication here now is back in October it was reported Rudy Giuliani was shooting off his mouth after too many limoncellos again, and he mentioned that the Manafort team had a joint cooperation agreement with the Trump team. Now, that sounded very weird to a lot of people at the time because he was cooperating with the government, and you don't do that when you have a cooperation agreement. Weirdly, though, there were a number of lawyers who also pointed out that in comparing the Rick Gates plea agreement, Manafort's associate who pled guilty months ago, and Manafort, there's one thing that was different between the two of them. Rick Gates had to agree that he would not share any information with any third party. That was left out of the Manafort agreement. Nobody knew why, seemed odd, but it was. So it's clear that Mueller knew from reporting, from Rudy Giuliani, shooting off his mouth, and the fact that it was in that agreement. And by the way, it was brought up to the special prosecutor's office. One lawyer on Twitter showed his text messages or emails to the special prosecutor asking for comment about this, and they replied, "We won't have any comment." In any case, they knew that Manafort was, theoretically anyway, talking to the Trump team, and that Rudy Giuliani was telling the press that he was. Well, this week, the New York Times reveals this on Tuesday night. They reveal this in a big splashy news story as if they just discovered it. Those of us who've been following the story already knew that. But they took credit for it, didn't give credit to Reuters or any of the other people who'd been questioning this. And implying anyway, and I looked closely at the story, and they didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear that this was a big part of why Mueller pulled the plug on the plea agreement. I don't believe it. I think it's because Manafort was lying, and we don't know, we don't know what he was lying about, but we're going to get some information from this sentencing memorandum.
Well, now hold on for 1 second.
Although that may go under seal as well.
We got to take a break here, because there's a lot, there is so much to unpack in just what you've said and going forward. But I want to do this, okay, as a little bit of a tease. The notion that the Mueller team was aware that Manafort, ostensibly going to become a witness for the state, more or less, was sharing information with the Trump team. The notion that Mueller was aware of that opens up some very, very intriguing possibilities as to what's been going on. And when we come back, we'll talk about those, in addition to what you are suggesting about Mueller offering up the facts that must be determined as to whether or not Manafort broke this deal. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, Digby and I will address this stuff. And this is it, folks. This stuff, I think, is really the fulcrum of this investigation. We will tell you why when we return.